Greetings, everyone. It is the Sabbath on March the 8th, and we're getting ready for Passover season. And there's a lot going on for the Passover. And today we're not going to continue in Hebrews. We're going to talk about something that's very, very important. It's been on my mind some, and it's finally gotten to the point where I need to say something about it. We're going to talk about the covenants, and we're going to talk about what happens between these two covenants. And we have a great many people that say there's this large dichotomy between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and that there are major differences between them. And in fact, there are massive differences. But the question comes up whether or not it's consistent with God, and whether or not there's some major difference in how we should be perceiving or doing things. And so I'm going to really clarify this in depth, because it's very important to understand how these things interact and how the law and both of the covenants interact. The first thing I need to say is that we're going to go at this from in a time fashion. So I'm going to cover some of the Old Covenant first, but it's really, really important to understand what's going on with the Old Covenant and to understand the difference between the Old Covenant and the law. And to understand the New Covenant, you really seriously, literally cannot completely clearly understand the New Covenant without understanding where the Old Covenant comes from and why it's there and what its purpose is. So when we look at this, I'm going to go back and forth some, but the real reasons for the difference that Christians see between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant are going to come out very, very strongly. So let's start for a minute. Let's start with the Old Covenant and what's going on with that. So the most important thing is to realize that the law is not the Old Covenant. So in your brain, when you think about the law, you need to separate it from the covenant. And that's doable. You cannot separate you can't separate everything. But what you have to realize is that the covenant itself, the agreement with God, was based on the people's performance with the law. But the promises that God made in that covenant, a lot of the promises that he made in that covenant were not based upon the law itself, but many of them were. So there's a disconnect between how we view God and the Old Covenant and the law. And the biggest thing is you just have to realize that the law is separate from the covenant. It's a component of the Old Covenant. It's something that exists for a purpose within that covenant. And it has very, very specific purpose with God and with men. So let's describe for a minute the purpose of the Old Covenant. The purpose of the Old Covenant is kind of dual, but the primary purpose of the Old Covenant was to give the people of God, the people that he chose, a standard for behavior, a way to behave, and give them something that they were supposed to do. And when you look at what God did to get to this point, it's extremely, extremely important to recognize that God, from his perspective, is looking down on the earth, and he is seeing all the families of the whole earth in this process. He's looking at everybody. He watched what happened with Adam and Eve all the way down to the flood. He went ahead and drowned everybody like a bunch of rats in Noah's time. And he chose to kill us off and then separate the languages so that we would be slower to do things. And when you look at it from God's perspective and what he has done in the past with this, you got to realize that he's doing these things for a purpose. The old covenant is based and focused on the behavior of people. And when God chose a people, when he found, Seth, and then he, I'm not going to name and list everybody, but, he said, all right, this Hebrew guy, he's kind of cool. And then he saw Abraham and he's like, all right, Abraham's my bud. Okay. He's a friend of God, and he's willing to do what I say. And he's willing to follow me. So God's looking at this and he's saying, all right, so I've looked at the Chinese, and I've looked at, the Indians, and I've looked at the Africans, and I've looked at the Europeans, which there were people in Europe at that point. He's looked at everybody and he says, all right, I like this Abraham guy, and there's nobody here that's doing it very well at all. But this Abraham guy is more faithful than anybody else. He actually believes me. And when you look at who Abraham was and who was still alive in Abraham's time, there were people that were several hundred years old that saw the flood, who had huge amounts of expertise with all kinds of different things. And they knew that God was there. Everybody knew. Everybody knew what it was all about. But Abraham was the best of all of those. And while everybody else was out there busily trying to avoid God and worshiping idols and doing various other things, Abraham was good with him. So he said, all right, you're my guy. I'm going to make all this stuff happen through you. So God's little breeding program started at that point. And he chose to give them something. In this covenant, he chose to give them something that they needed that would lead them to God. And that was the law. But the covenant itself is related to all the promises that he made to us. He gave us a whole bunch of promises and said, all right, here's what you're going to do. If you follow me, then I'm going to give you a whole bunch of blessings. And if you decide you're not going to follow me, then I'm going to give you a whole bunch of curses. And when you do the things that are contained in the sword that I'm going to lay down right in the middle of you, which is called the law, I'm not going to go into depth about that because I've talked about it an enormous amount. The sword was there coming out of Eden. The sword was, created because of transgression with Adam and Eve. And the purpose of God's sword was and is to cut, to kill people who sin, who disbelieve him on that direct basis and transgress against his law and against everything that he says. The reality of the law is that's its purpose. And when you consider that he laid a sword down in the middle of this covenant, he did that for a reason. So what is the effect of the sword? What's the purpose of the sword? The purpose of the sword is to give men a way to behave. Everything about their behavior in everyday life, the law is there to help them to do it right and to kill them when they don't. And anybody who uses their brain for even 5 minutes and backs off enough to be able to see what the law's purpose is, it's to govern people. The law is there to govern people and to kill anybody who trespasses. Say, oh, well, of course it is. Of course it is. All right. When you look at modern day Israel, what is their law like? They use God's sword, at least in part, for their national law. It's there from all the way back from Moses, all the way up into present modern day Israel. The law is still a part of how they do everyday business. Everybody conducts themselves with at least some relation to that law. This is really, really important. Really, really important. Why? Because the law shows us what we should and should not do as people on the earth. He keeps saying this like it's some big thing, you're saying. Why does he keep saying it this way? Because the new covenant is entirely different. The new covenant is not primarily designed to change the behavior of men on this planet. Maybe I should say that differently. It is not primarily designed to interact with physical people on this earth. That's not its primary purpose. So when you look at the difference between the old covenant and the new covenant, you have to realize something. The new covenant doesn't work for people. It doesn't work for physical people. It's not designed for physical people. It does work. But let's face it, if you follow the new covenant as a person on this planet, you are volunteering yourself as a victim. You are a victim. If you follow what Christ said and you do what he said, Matthew 5:7 and lots of other places, you are going to be a victim. You are going to be trounced into the ground at some point. What prevents Christians from being destroyed in this country right now? The laws of the United States of America. God's law doesn't prevent us from being trounced, doesn't prevent us from being victims, doesn't prevent us from a whole lot of things in the new covenant. Under the new covenant, the law does not protect us. Doesn't. God can, and sometimes does. But the reality of it is that the new covenant was not designed for people. Physical people on the planet. It was designed specifically to turn us into spiritual beings in the future. That's the purpose of the new covenant. The old covenant was designed to let us live on this planet. You know, if you're going to follow the law, you shall even live in the law. If you look at what the purpose of the Old Covenant and the Old Testament and the law were, they were to moderate people's interactions, just like every government on this planet today. Government is designed to allow people to move forward in the presence of conflict. That's the purpose of government. That's the primary purpose of any government, is to allow people who don't agree to do something. Because who agrees? Well, you got one party here, and you got one party there, and you got another party here. If you're in Italy, you've got 328 parties. The realities of these things are, very simply, that a government is there to control people who don't want the same things. That's what politics is about. Getting people to agree even when they don't. And doing something. So there's always going to be controversy in politics. You think God didn't realize that? And God didn't know what was going on? God knew what was going on. How did he know? Because he made the law in the first place. He made the first government. He made the whole thing work the way he wanted it to work. He made a law for physical people. And that law was pointed towards the spiritual. It was pointed that direction. The old covenant was designed to bring people to a certain place at a certain time so that they could and would embrace the spiritual. The old covenant was there to get God's people where he wanted them so that he could introduce a new covenant and a better thing. That was his purpose. And when the Messiah came down here and he chose to sacrifice himself and he chose to save us from death, he gave us the opportunity to become sons of God. Every Jew knows that that's their destiny, to become sons of the living God. That's why it was such a big deal when the new covenant came along. But you have to realize that when you start to enter this new covenant, you have to be able to deal with the old covenant or any other government, any other law for people that exists around you. Now, we've just been going through Hebrews. Really, really striking difference between the Hebrews and between the Gentile churches. But regardless of whether you're part of one of the Gentile churches, I say that, or whether you're part of the Hebrew church from before, because there's still a difference, the reality is that we still have to interact with governments. Whether it's the Israeli government, the US government, the British government, the Russian government, or wherever and whoever you are, anywhere in the world, you have to deal with physical governments and with laws related to these things. And this is not dissimilar from how we have to deal with God's law itself. What does the government do when you sin against it? When you commit murder or you break some law, they punish you. That's what they do. And it's the same with God's law. But we don't tend to recognize that God's law has intrinsic punishment in it. If you're a physical man and you're standing on this planet and you break God's law, which we all do every day, there is a certain amount of death that we build up. If you don't think that you're full of sin, then you are just dramatically wrong. There are so many sins that we're involved in. You have a retirement fund, you're a user. Straight up. No doubt about it, you're a user. You use American dollars, US dollars, you use unjust weights and balances. You use Russian rubles, you use unjust weights and balances. It doesn't matter which government you're from or where you're at. The reality is, if you're not doing the things that God said in his law and in that old covenant, then you better have a good reason. And there's only one good reason. And that's in faith that you are walking in God's will, doing what he wants you to do in this time. And let me tell you, that's not as easy as the Protestant world would have you think. It's not that easy. God's law comes around for a reason. And the new covenant allows you to get past the law. It doesn't condemn the law. It doesn't throw the law away. The law is independent of the covenants. You really, really need to understand that it's independent of the covenants. It's part of the old covenant directly. It is not directly part of the new covenant. But God's going to write his law in our hearts and our minds forever. Yes, he is. He's going to make it part of our existence on an everyday life, everyday circumstance. But guess what? That's for the people he likes. That's for the people he likes. He hasn't done it yet, except for in very rare circumstances. Look that up. It's a specific timed prophecy of a particular time, particular circumstance in the end time. The situation with this law business is that it's independent of the covenants. Think of the covenant kind of like a sheath, the old covenant, kind of like a sheath. The law is there, but it doesn't exist there permanently. It can be taken out and moved around. What's the purpose of God's law? The purpose of God's law is to kill all the evildoers. The primary purpose in the end time. I'm not saying there aren't other purposes, because there are. But the primary purpose of the law in the end time is to kill all the sinners, all the evildoers. That's its purpose. If you're a transgressor of God's law, which he brought to this earth long before Moses used it in the Old Covenant, I say, well, how can that be? And I'll give you a really good example. God doesn't just kill anybody for any reason at any time. He can, he's allowed to, but he doesn't do it. He kills people who are transgressors. Well, who's he killed? The really easy example is the flood. He killed everybody except for 8 people. And he did it according to the law. He did it according to the fact that in Adam all died. Everybody died. Oh, you shall not surely die. They all died. They had no shot at getting back into the Garden of Eden or to the tree of life. No shot at all whatsoever. If you don't have a shot at the tree of life, all you have is death. And God killed all of them, except for 8 people. He killed all those people according to his law. And he did a whole bunch of things with the law. And at some point he said, all right, well, my people are special, and I need to deal with this circumstance and deal with them in a good way. So I'm going to lay my sword right down in the midst of them. And they're going to come to understand who I am based upon my sword that I set there. And it will cut them when they do evil in my sight. And I will do well to them. That's the other part of the covenant, not the sword. The other part of the covenant is God doing well for us when we do well. Yes, it's sort of built into the sword, but the sword's got sharp edges, and it determines whether you live or whether you die. And if you do the things that are in the law, contained in the law, then God's blessings will be upon you. And if you don't do the things contained within the law, you get the edge. You get pierced. You get sliced. And that was our destiny until our Messiah came and gave us a better covenant, a new covenant. He didn't destroy the law when he did it. The law had to still be there. Why? Because God's not letting all the evildoers, all the evil people in the world into his kingdom. He's not doing it. And the law is there to stop anyone from entering the paradise of God whom God doesn't want to enter. Very simple. The old covenant still has teeth. Can you keep it? No. It's impossible. It is not possible to keep the law. Well, why not? We got the old covenant right there, the Old Testament. We got the law. We know what to do in the law. Yeah. But you can't keep it. And it'll never get you past physical life. The law in the Old Covenant never promised anything beyond a good life if you obey on this world, and then death. That's what the Old Covenant promised. God made certain other promises that are not specifically related directly to the Old Covenant and to the law, but there's nothing in the Old Covenant that could get you into God's kingdom. There's nothing. Can't be done. If you don't believe that, then you should really study your Bible, both Old and New Covenants. In Adam, all men died. In Jesus Christ, he made all who would obey in faith alive. And anyone who won't gets the sword. You need to understand this. You've got to understand this. Because the new covenant is wonderful. And it expands upon your behavior that you should be doing well in the Old Covenant. God gave us the measure, the standard for behavior in the Old Covenant. In the New Covenant, he expanded that. He made it more important that you do things. You're not even to look on upon a woman, to lust after her, to commit adultery. He expanded it. He made it greater and stronger. But the things that he added to it don't kill you. I mean, they will eventually kill you in the long run. But that wasn't the purpose of the new covenant. The purpose of the new covenant was to get past the sword. It wasn't to get past the old covenant, at least not entirely. It was to get past the sword of God that kills evildoers. So what's our goal? Our goal is to not be evildoers who have faith and belief in our Messiah, in Jesus the Christ, who walked upon this planet. You have to realize that the difference between Judaism and Christianity is not really that great, except for one great thing. Our behavior is supposed to be very, very similar. Between the Old Testament and the New, it's supposed to be very, very similar. Really, really important that you recognize the differences between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant in the big picture. Because the big picture is frequently what allows people to make a decision for life or for death. And we can study all the little intricacies of it all day long. But if you don't get the big picture, you're in big trouble. Because the law's not going to save you. Is the law still around? Yeah, it's still around. 100%. Nailed to the cross? Under certain circumstances, it doesn't have any effect on us. If you have God's Holy Spirit in power and in strength, and if you're walking in God's will daily, how many people are doing that? As far as I can see, none. Looking around, there are some people who know some things and do some things right. There are some people with faith. But where are the people walking around with God's Holy Spirit and power who have no health issues? They've been healed. They've been given an atonement. They walk around like Peter. And if their shadow falls on somebody, they're healed. Do we see that anywhere? The answer is absolutely not. We have a problem in the end time. It's really, really important that you recognize how these covenants interact, because they have a direct effect on your life in this time. I try to tell people that we're living in the end time. And I tell them, Ezekiel 7. An end is come. The end is come upon my people. And they look at me like, well, of course it's the end time. Yeah. And they have absolutely no understanding of what that means. The gritty reality of what that means. In the end time, everything ends. It ends. It stops. Our lives end. People say, oh, well, yeah, we go up in the rapture and, we go straight from my houses to, we got my house, my Mercedes and this and that and the other thing. And now suddenly I'm going to get wafted up into the air to meet Christ when he returns. And I say, no, hardly. I'm not going to debunk the rapture, the fake rapture, again today. But the realities of it are that we're living in the end time. And if you don't get that, then it doesn't matter what covenant you're interested in. Shall I be a Jew? Shall I be a Christian? Which should I be? It's easy to be a Jew. Relatively, it's easy to be a Jew. Why? Because all you have to do is follow this physical set of rules that make sense to you. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It's a lot easier than looking somewhere else to become something that you aren't currently. The law and the old covenant are relatively easy to grasp. Oh, well, I want a fair government with good people that are doing things the way God wanted them done. They say, oh, well, new old covenant right there. Let's go do that because, law contains all of the rules for behavior for people. And it points towards something spiritual and better. But it's not until you get to the new covenant that you have to start behaving like God. You have to start behaving like God. Are God's thoughts all over the place? New covenant, every thought into captivity. Every thought into captivity. You think we're going to be spirit beings running around thinking about all kinds of horrible things and then we're just going to behave really nicely? Don't be an idiot. God's thoughts and his actions are all fully aligned. His emotional status, everything with God is fully aligned, and it goes the direction he wants it to go. He points this direction, his emotions, his actions, his thoughts, everything are in that straight line. Humans? Not so much. Not so much. We think about this, we think about that, we think about 46 other things that a lot of it's just demonic injection, and a lot of it's our own wickedness and obsession. We're obsessed about everything. And lots of it's wickedness. So while we think about it, we don't always necessarily do it. But our brain's going all over the place. All over the place. And our actions? How often are they actually aligned with our emotions? Do we actually love our wife or our husband? A lot of times we do. Do we behave like that all the time? No. Children? No. It's like we've got 3 or 4 different spinning tops, and all of them have an arrow on them, and they're never lined up. And yet, God always is perfectly aligned. And what's the purpose of the New Testament? To get us aligned with God, to walk in faith and do his will according to how he wants it done. That's what the new covenant's all about. Becoming one with God, following his will. Not mixing personalities, because that's just stupid, but walking in God's will, aligning ourselves with him perfectly. Not like we're in some government somewhere. Anywhere. How many political camps are there in God's kingdom? One. One political camp. We don't get it. We think it's normal for people to just constantly disagree all the time. We think it's normal for people to fight. And it is in a human world. And that's what the law was created for. It was there to mediate the differences between people and the behavior of people. And it's going to continue that in the New Testament, New Covenant. But it's going to be built in, written in your heart and in your mind, at a particular time. That's the sword. It's going to be written in your heart and your mind. What is the sword going to do then? What is its purpose in the new covenant? Purpose of the sword that's written in your heart and in your mind is to prevent you from transgressing against God. It's a standard that God made that is going to be built into us. It's not now. Now we can do whatever we want. But once we have chosen to follow God, really, really important,